Hello and welcome to the 10th Understanding class live stream. Today we have a small panel with a new member. Let's introduce this new member all the way from somewhere in Canada. I think Winnipeg. We have Bob. Bob, how's it going?
It's going great. Thank you so much for inviting me to this.
Cool. It's very good to have you. You come highly recommended from Kyle, although Kyle has got a very poor taste. Kyle, where are you today?
Still in Calgary. Yesterday was Canada Day, which I did not celebrate because Canada is one of the worst climate criminals in the world and is not changing that in any way. So
keeping it real.
So the flag is a butcher's apron, as you would say, Tom.
That's what I like to call them. Yeah. It's like my friend Kev always says that about, he calls it to English people. We both live in London. He always points out if there's ever a flag, a Union Jack anywhere, he goes, "Oh, look, the butcher's apron." I like it. Right. Today we are dealing with Bob has been for those who don't know, Bob's been on GIU a couple of times. Bob, do you want to say a bit more about yourself or anything like that, or do you want to remain vaguely anonymous?
I'll say a tiny bit about myself. I mean, I came through with Kyle in the same grad program, a media studies and communications program, and we've been friends ever since. I think back in the day, I don't know if we were called the Marxist Statler and Waldorf, or we just referred to ourselves as that.
No, that was one of our classmates called us that.
And like these days, I'm like just a middling academic who studies energy politics and oil industry communication strategies. Yeah, in Canada. That's my thing. Yeah.
Very good. Did any of you see that? This is a digression, but there was a film set in the oil industry, or a series called Tin Star. With did you see that one, Bob?
You know, I don't think I have, but it sounds kind of familiar. Tin Star in the Canadian rock. Oh, I got to watch this. I'm looking at it online now. This looks very cool.
It was actually really good. It's like Tim Roth, and it's about them trying to get, I kind of forget now. It's he was some kind of like shenanigans going on between like some security guard working in one of these oil drilling operations, but and things go kind of hilariously wrong. But it's a good program. I just jumped into my mind when we started talking about Canada energy policy for some reason. Right. Okay, so we are halfway through chapter 5. Chapter 5. Shit, I have to get the book. Let me get the book. Where is the book? I like to have the book open beside me. Is it there? There she is. Okay.
I will just mention that people need to compare Tin Star to the definitive film about the Canadian oil industry, Fubar 2.
I like the sound of that. Is that like really crap?
Yeah, that's pretty crap. Like in the Fubar 1 was about a bunch of like loser metalheads, and then in Fubar 2 they go on to become oil workers, oil industry workers. So it's a very stupid comedy. But one of the few films about the oil industry that was made in Canada that's like, a fictional film, not a non-fiction one.
And is it amusing?
Your mileage may vary. If your tastes are very juvenile, then you may enjoy it. But I'm not saying it's actually a good movie. I'm just saying it's one of the ones that exists.
Because I never saw Fubar 1, but I recall that it was very popular in Canada when it came out. But my understanding is that humor was like very, very juvenile and silly because they're these hoser metalheads, right? So
exactly, yes.
I doubt they have much to say that is particularly insightful about the oil industry, but maybe they do. I don't know.
I'm looking here on Rotten Tomatoes. It's got 90%, so I think that's a watcher. That's going to be a
All
watcher.
right. Yeah, Fubar was like the movie of my high school senior year. My class was obsessed with it.
Yeah, I was obsessed for a while with Freddy Got Fingered. If we're talking about bad comedy.
Yes, another classic of Canadian comedy. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. An exceptionally bad film, but some moments of extreme hilarity. Okay. Right. So we would just gone and we had gone through how Mann was laying out power organizations as, what do you say? That how power organizations determine the structure and transformation of society. And today we're going to hit into classes as economic power organizations. Okay, so Kyle, do you want to open off and take the first slide for us?
Sure thing. Classes in this framework are a particular kind of collective actor formed into organizations that deploy economic power resources. Mann does not, however, provide a compact definition of class organizations so that one would know for sure that a particular economic power organization was an instance of a quote-unquote class organization, as opposed to some other kind of economic power organization. The closest we get is statements that point to classes as economic power organizations whose economic power is derived from, quote, rights over economic resources. Sections are subdivisions of classes. They acquire their conceptual status as a section by virtue of being nested within a class organization. Segments are economic power organizations that combine heterogeneous sets of rights over economic resources. This is what it means to say that segments cross-cut classes.
Okay, so what's he saying here about sections and segments, Kyle?
Well, I mean, Wright is basically calling him out, right? Because he's like, well, you don't define what a class organization is other than maybe a class. And then sections are subdivisions of classes, which are nested within a class organization. But if the only instance of a class organization is a class, then how could they be nested within it? It doesn't make sense. And then we have the segments that are basically like hybrid, heterogeneous, cross-class economic power organizations, like, I don't know, you could say like political parties, right?
I was going to say, yeah, party, right? Like,
but it would have to be like, say the Chinese Communist Party, right? Like has like a very strong economic dimension as well as being a political cross-class organization.
And I got a question, Kyle, or for you, Tom. Like when I read sections, am I misinterpreting this to translate that into fractions? Like it just reminds me of like a class fraction, like capital is divided into multiple fractions, kind of related to sectors, and even particular sectors might have fractions. Like I study the oil industry in Canada, and it's like there's large capital firms that are in particular places within relations of fossil fuel production. There's like the smaller driller organizations. They're different fractions, but they might unite within particular organizations. So I guess my one question I have is whether or not sections can be read that way, because that's the only way it makes tons of sense to me. And then the second thing, I'm curious that I have difficulty through the rest of the chapter. Like, what does Mann really mean by a class organization? Is that just is he talking about actual organizations like a network of trade unions or
I think he's talking like I think he's trying to talk about, like, when he's talking about classes here as economic power organizations, as classes for themselves, as opposed to classes, in themselves, that kind of Marxist distinction. I say, that's what I think. Kyle, correct me if I'm wrong, but like with sections here, I think your fraction would be a section, but a section doesn't necessarily need to be a fraction.
Okay.
Like as in, like the section could just be groups of workers across different like actual industries. There could be some kind of organization that wouldn't actually be like a fraction of capital linked to it, say.
I think Mann wants it to mean something different than a fraction, like being something that has other potential applications. But the only examples he provides are classes, and sections of classes would be class fractions. So they're effectively identical, even though Mann would suggest they're not, because you could have, I don't know, some other kind of economic power organization that he doesn't specify, which has sections of it. But in practice, they are just class fractions, yes.
But like, take for example something like, say, a typical right-wing, like dominant party, like the Tory party in England. It's not the case that the Tory party is made up just of like bourgeois business owners. It's also got a working class base of membership.
Yeah, but it's also not an economic power organization, right?
Okay, but we did not say political organizations earlier.
No, that's why I was saying it had to be something like the Chinese Communist Party, where it's like literally a economic organization as well as a political one. Cool. Like you'd have to have like some kind of Bonapartist economic planning situation going on to have something like that.
Okay. So here's a question, and it's related to something that I suspect I'll bring back in a little bit later as Mann kind of as Wright develops his critique of Mann, especially the implications. It's especially like what he directly says in terms of his framework for class, and then the actual practicality of how he applies it. Wright goes on to critique this, but like would, for instance, an industry association or a chamber of commerce be an example? Like an economic power organization
I think you could. So this is just an extrapolation. It's not something Mann actually says, but I think like a reasonable example of an economic power organization that is not a class would be something like OPEC, because OPEC has like literal rights over economic resources, whereas a chamber of commerce doesn't like derive its economic rights, or sorry, it wouldn't make use of its economic rights as a corporate entity. It would only, like, the individual corporations that make up the chamber of commerce would do that, right? Because like they whereas like OPEC, it's a cartel, so they literally have to do things in concert in order for it to be effective.
Okay.
Yeah, it could be kind of. I think, like, could you think of like the Chamber of Commerce thing as kind of quasi? Like
it's very close, but I would say
not exactly what Mann is talking about.
Yeah, if we want to follow the definition that sorry, no, I'm getting confused, because you're completely right, because they would be an economic power organization, but according to Mann's definition of a class, we would actually see OPEC as a class as well.
I see, yeah.
Because it's an economic power organization whose economic power is derived from rights over economic resources.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Because the reason I like the OPEC example. The reason I go to things like Chamber of Commerce or industry associations is that as we proceed, Wright is going to call out Mann, right, for like essentially not having any meaningful way to explain how members of a class actually come to form some kind of like collective identity and the capacity to exert collective action. And because I study capitalist class organizing, it's like in my mind, it's like, oh yeah, like industry, various capitalist class fractions have all sorts of organizations and have developed them over time, precisely because they don't all the individual actors are in competition with each other in the marketplace, even if they're also relatively united against workers, and they need means in order to determine some kind of collective interest that they can pursue politically, right?
Yeah, that would match I think the sort of vaguely defined idea of an economic power organization. Yes.
Okay. Now that we've cleared all this up, let's go on to the next slide. No, it's like there is this whole thing. Well, no, I won't go say it. We'll get to the stuff here. Okay, Kyle, do you want to keep going with this section?
Sure. Understood this way, the core agenda of class analysis is understanding the patterns of formation of classes as power organizations and how these have developed historically. So again, remember, we're talking about classes as power organizations being roughly equivalent to the idea of the class for itself. In most of human history, Mann claims that classes were not the main form of economic power organizations. Until recently, segments and sections usually predominated over classes. Classes were generally only quote-unquote latent owners, that is, like the class in itself. Laborers and others struggled, but usually semi-covertly, intensively, confined to an everyday local level. Most extensive struggle was between segments. Classes in this framework are a particular kind of collective actor formed into organizations that deploy economic power resources. So this is he's not saying, I don't think that segments are classes, but rather that in contrast to the segments, classes are a kind of collective actor formed into organizations that deploy economic power resources. The main story about classes in the course of the development of capitalism is the gradual emergence of class as the predominant form of economic power organization, first among capitalists and then later among laborers. While no capitalist society reached the point predicted by Marx of fully polarized, symmetrical, extensive class organizations engaged in a head-on dialectical struggle with one another, capitalist development did generate a predominance of class organization and at least some tendencies towards extensive forms of class conflict.
Right. Where do we start with this? Do we if we were to look at feudalism, do we not see like classes operating in feudalism? Do we not see the feudal landlords were operating as a class? They may be intra-feudal warfare, but like that can be, is that not analogous to intrastate capitalist warfare or intra-firm capitalist warfare?
I would say that in feudalism, the strongest expression you get of a conscious, like a self-conscious class organization is when you see these little eruptions of capitalism that are trying to overthrow the feudal order. And the reaction against that tends to be like of a class nature, right? There is a sort of, you see these kinds of like collective feudal efforts to put down bourgeois revolts. And other than that, I think it is, I mean,
I have a question, Kyle. What about even the existence of a king or, of a royalty as a class kind of compromise between feudal warlords? That like is the kingdom itself not a class? It shows that there is class activity.
I mean, there's definitely class activity. The question is whether it is a class in it or a class for itself. That's the question, right? Like, as opposed to sort of unconsciously individual monarchs fighting against the church for their secular power, a collective of monarchs trying to suppress the power of the church as like, this is in favor of secular feudal power, right? Like, so because absolutely there is class struggle going on in feudalism, but class organization, I think it happens sometimes, but it's not the main form of social conflict, I wouldn't think. Yeah, maybe
Under feudalism.
Yeah, under feudalism. There's maybe like you could look at like guild interests, but I don't know. Guild interests, like I think as Marx points out, are quite internally divided between the masters and the journeymen, right? And that's a corporate interest that the guilds would fight for, as opposed to a class interest, because it's like it's a what do you call it here in this analysis, a segment of the masters and the journeymen.
I see.
Like feudal society was really messy and complicated. That's why I'm hesitant to say that you see self-conscious class organization. I mean, except for like peasant revolts, right?
Well, this
like
is
peasant
kind of
revolts
what
are pretty straightforward, a class organization.
And did feudal like lords and aristocrats, like the aristocratic class, like would they ever team like start coordinating when they were worried about revolts, or did they continue being in competition with each other? Because like one of the interesting things I would argue about capitalist class power, and that I actually think comes out of this chapter and some or this interesting things to tease out in his kind of, I guess, critical engagement with Mann, right, is that like capitalists under capitalism are like the reason why they tend to form kind of like political power organizations or whatever you want to call them is because the structure of the market means that even though they are even though their power is based on exploitation of workers, they are also often in competition with each other in the market. And they actually like require organizational forms that can allow them to pursue their collective interests and even come to understand what their collective interests are vis-a-vis other classes. And that's kind of like what the political scientist Fred Fisher used to call like a rolling consensus. Like that's what those sorts of organizations do. And is there any, so I guess, but it seems from the way you're describing it is that like under feudalism, maybe the aristocratic class doesn't have that level of self-conscious organization. And that's an organization that under capitalism, I would argue, doesn't emerge. And this is Mann's problem, I think, in terms of this, the way it's described in this chapter is capitalists or workers don't necessarily spontaneously develop that shared understanding. There's usually some kind of political struggle, some kind of organizational attempts. There are fractions of members within classes. Gramsci called them organic intellectuals that work to organize other members, and it's not really immediately obvious from the outstart. Even if they're sharing a similar structural position within relations to production, there tends to be some kind of political labor almost that goes.
I think that maybe it didn't start out as this, but maybe you could see the Holy Roman Empire as a kind of feudal like collective actor, right? Because like once the emperor, like there's sort of that middle period where like the Habsburgs aren't like super overly predominant in their power, but the power of the Holy Roman Emperor has also been checked, that like the HRE is kind of existing as a club for feudal lords to have their little petty bits of property and exploit their peasants, and kind of work together to protect that economic resource, right? Those economic rights. So I think that there is like That would probably be the strongest one I could point to in terms of like a self-conscious feudal class organization, even though it wasn't founded with that in mind, right? It was founded to be like literally just a normal ass empire.
We've got to eventually, it's like, oh, we need to rationalize the different factions of the ruling classes of Europe, because if not, we're not going to be able to maintain, like there's going to be chaos, or we're going to lose our position.
Yeah, like, oh, we're all these little tiny lords. How are we going to stand up against France? How are we going to stand up against Poland? And we don't want a Holy Roman Emperor running the show and telling us what to do. But if we do keep this collective organization around, then we can kind of do like collective self-defense of our feudal property.
How does something like the Magna Carta fit into this? Like,
but then you're already like,
now you're already at the tail end of feudalism.
Yes, exactly. It's like it is. That is certainly a like a conscious class effort among the aristocracy to check royal power. But I don't know if it corresponds to a what you would call like an actual organization that's like ongoing and a class organization. I think you don't really see the emergence of like the Tory party as an aristocratic class organization until you start to see the emergence of capitalism, right?
Well, yeah, I'm not too hot up on the history, to be honest, but the Tories were the landed gentry, weren't they? And the Whigs was yeah. But and
there were like some members of the aristocracy who were Whigs, but they tended to have like a different. They tend to have a more diversified economic interest than the Tories, who were moored into their like feudal landownings.
Right. Okay. So anything else in this then we haven't covered in this? Do we feel like? Is there any other points in this slide then we haven't? I think we've dealt with it all, haven't we?
I mean, I guess just generally to say, like, what Mann is saying here basically corresponds to what Marx lays out at the start of Capital in terms of a theory of history and class development, right? That it's it's not until you get capitalism that like the sort of key to history is unlocked and revealed. Before that, things are just very confused between a bunch of different like segmental struggles that obscure the class conflict.
Right. Okay. So let's see here. Okay. I'll take this next bit. Okay. So continuing in this vein of argumentation, Mann's class analysis is thus firmly anchored in the third conceptual cluster of class analysis we discussed earlier. So let's go back here and see if we can see what this third one is. This is from where do we have it? So I think this is class relations. Is the common term to both micro and macro level. Class relations are defined. Okay, so this is class relations between classes. That's what he's talking about there. Okay, let me just edit. I'll edit this back in. Okay, 1 second. Okay. The third conceptual cluster of class analysis discussed earlier. These are the relations between classes. He goes further, rejecting the usefulness of any systematic analysis of the objective relational aspects of class structures. Commenting on Marx's discussion of capitalists and proletarians as economically defined classes, he writes, such classes might be considered objective, but we might choose to define classes by other objective, inverted commas, criteria. So-called industrial society theorists distinguish classes according to their specialized role in the division of labor, which method yields numerous occupational classes. Weberians identify classes according to market capacities producing many classes based on ownership of property, scarce job skills, professional powers, and educational levels. How do we choose among these equally, inverted commas, objective schemes? The economic without organizational criteria gives only what I term latent class, corresponding roughly to the term objective class or class in itself. Such a latent class is of little sociological interest. Theorists may develop what analytical categories they like as ideal types, but only some of these help explain the real world. If classes are significant power actors in the real world, they must be organized extensively or politically. So this is getting to your point. Ben, is it? This is the point you made earlier.
Yes. Oh, it's Bob, like the palindrome.
Bob.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
why
yeah.
I was going. Oh my god! I have brain freeze. I've only met. Sorry, because I've only met listeners. I've only met Bob today, so I was like, sorry. I feel really bad.
No. All good. No, I think so. It's like it's like Mann is really because like it's very interesting because like the very first I've been annotating my PDF of the book, and like the very first page I just wrote, like I just put a little comment like in itself for itself ? Like what's going on there, right? Like, and it seems that like what he's doing here, or the way that Wright frames what he's doing here, it's like he's calling out. Maybe I'm stretching the metaphor a little too far, but it's what I always call. Sometimes like I used to call my students when people still used to watch the cartoon South Park underpants gnome logic, right? Like there's an episode of South Park where like there's like these underpants gnomes who like steal the kids' underpants where they're asleep, and it's supposed to be just like a riff on the idea that like you lose socks and underwear in like the laundry machine, you never really know where they go, right? And like they like track the underpants gnomes like underneath to like their underground layer, and they're trying to figure out like, well, why are you stealing everyone's underpants? They look like these little lawn gnomes or whatever, right? And they're like, oh yeah, well, we've got like this 3-point plan to profit, right? And it's like step 1 is steal underpants, and then like step 2 is like question mark, it just says question mark, and then step 3 is profit.
Yeah,
right. Mann's trying to go straight from stealing underpants to profit. Like it's like, well, how the heck do they gain the capacity to act collectively in organizations, whether as an economic power organization that defines a class, or whether or not an organization that is a segment that brings different people from different classes? Like there has to be some connection between people's capacity, like a class's capacity or members of a class's capacity to act collectively within an organization and their position within relations of production. And if not, what are you studying? Like, why not just be a pluralist like Robert Dahl? Like, I don't really understand. Like, why not just be a liberal? Like, what's the point of doing class analysis? It feels weird to me. It feels like a weird framework. I don't understand how he's getting to the profit part of the underpants gnome equation. Yeah.
Is Mann a liberal? You're muted, Kyle.
Oh, I said I don't know. I just know about him from this chapter. But he seems kind of lib, but like trying to make use of like some of Marx's ideas. Yeah.
How do you write a sentence like this? Like the one I've highlighted, such a latent class.
I mean, you have to be an academic to write something so incredibly stupid.
It makes no sense, right? Like, and to be clear, I'm not saying I think Mann's a liberal. I'm just saying that there are assumptions there that don't make sense. Like what he's what he's trying to analyze doesn't make a lot of sense if what he says is of little sociological interest is actually of little sociological interest.
Yeah, I would suggest
who joins. Like, what's the logic behind who joins them, right? Like, why not just roll a dice and then pick a name out of the phone book and ask them to join your union organization?
It's a stochastic theory of class.
Yeah, it was like
I would suggest that like Mann's arguments here are motivated not by his class interest, but by his sectional interest as an academic careerist. That he's really just trying to stir up controversy in order to make a controversy around himself. That like this is so incredibly stupid that it's like almost beneath comment.
Yeah.
But somehow these things happen where people like take a reasonable theory, like, Marxist theory, and then just cut out one of the core sections and is like, oh, it's my new theory that makes no sense at all, but I'm just going to mind fuck everybody by saying this like it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I remember, like, Kyle, I think you and we've talked before about like Terry Eagleton's book on his ideology primer, right? Like ideology introduction. And there's this great section. I always come back to it where he's trying to go after like the post-Marxists like Laclau and Mouffe and so on, who essentially see no meaningful connection to people's position within relations of production in terms of which groups are likely to join up with other groups in a socialist movement or a populist movement or whatever.
Just like hyper-Leninism, right? Like,
yeah,
they're like all that matters is the political.
That's
the
right.
Economic is irrelevant.
That's right. And I think what those sorts of things are trying to do, there's a certain logic to it in the sense that, like, as you start realizing there's no necessary one-to-one connection between being in a particular class position and a particular ideological self-understanding that you're guaranteed to have, right? But as Eagleton points out, there's a difference between saying there's necessarily no connection between your position within relations production and your self-understanding as a class, and saying that there is necessarily no connection, right? Like there's there's no necessary connection and necessarily no connection. Because he's like, well, if there's literally no connection, why don't like between your positions in relations of production and the political movements and you're likely to be part of, and the organizations you're likely to be part of, why don't socialists just pool all of their money and just like target the like 10 wealthiest billionaires on the planet and try to convince them to be socialists with like a really good framing campaign?
Yeah. Not that it hasn't been tried, but
But the second you ask that question, it becomes immediately apparent that this is a ridiculous concept, right? Like that is not a good use of your political resources and energy to try to convince Elon Musk to joining the socialist vanguard.
Maybe they're kids. That's who you're more likely to get. Rich heirs. But like, didn't Ralph Nader write a book on like the title like something like "Only the Billionaire Can Save Us Now"? Literally making the pitch to like switch a billionaire over into our class, and then we can use his money. I think Ralph Nader wrote one like that.
Like, it's not to say that you don't have individual, extremely wealthy people who become socialists or communists. Like, obviously there's like angles, but like, during
he's not that wealthy.
No, I know, but like if you look at like say like the CPUSA in its heyday, there were a lot of rich women, like bourgeois women, in the CPUSA, and it's like these things can happen, but you can't call that a class organization. That's a political cause that they're taking out. They're engaging in individually, right? Like it's like you can't have a socialist or communist party that's literally just made up of middle class intellectuals. Like if it doesn't have any working class basis, it's not a class organization other than just being a middle class, like, I don't know, wankery club, right?
Yeah. Well, the only point I'll kind of satirically poke back on is that you can indeed have such an organization, and they do indeed exist. Like,
Oh, you can have it, but it doesn't fit.
It's not a coherent economic
Mann's
power
definition
organization. Yes, that's right.
of what a class
right.
organization is, right?
It becomes a weird middle class cosplay festival. Yeah.
Yeah.
The Canadian left is full of those organizations and parties, right?
Well, every left party in the history of ever has been full of intellectuals like that. It's just the ones that have only that they're not a political force. Yeah, okay, yeah, so yeah, there we have Ralph Nader's Only the Super Rich Can Save Us book of 2009, when Nader was like, yo, have you considered getting Elon to bankroll Utopia?
Dear God. I remember that was he was pitching that one very hard on Democracy Now, back in my Democracy Now, coming out of my early leftist days, finding Democracy Now. It's like, wow, that was that's where I knew about that one. Okay, let me keep going and read this next bit of slide. Furthermore, we're continuing here. In effect, Mann argues that much of what class and stratification analysts study is of little sociological interest because they focus on the efforts of objective properties of the locations of people within social structures rather than the effects of collectively organized power actors. That to me just makes no sense. But okay, Mann's dismissal of the analysis of objective properties of class relations would be compelling if it were the case that there were no systematic causal connections between these properties and the formation of collective power actors that are Mann's central concern. However, if the objective properties of the social relations of production make certain kinds of power organizations more likely and sustainable than others, class analysis should pay attention to both of these conceptual clusters. Like, when he takes it out of like this idea of it coming out of the production relations and ownership relations, then he's just left with like no causal mechanism. It's nearly like these things are just like they appear out of nowhere. You know, it's a very non-scientific approach.
They're clustered around economic rights, but the origin of those economic rights is a complete mystery.
Right. It's like a prime mover argument. You know, no, like there's no prime, you know, sorry, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, it just emerged out of the ether, like, you know, like the endowments people have in neoclassical economic theory.
Right. It's the clumpiness of the universe after the Big Bang. That's what we're talking about.
I don't know, Tom. That sounds pretty objective to me. I look askance at that framework of you know.
It's too materialist.
Yeah, it's too materialist. I think we should really just be focusing on the social conscious dimension of things.
Yeah, some kind of form of some sort of like a psychoaffective feeling that just emerges from the ether somehow, and right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say it's actually like probably being beamed down to us from space aliens on the other side of the galaxy. That's probably where these class organizations are originating from.
So someone's beefing up on their simulation theory.
Yeah, it's like the Matrix, man. these are just the teams they put us on in this big game.
Which is and the game is based on like the servers for the game are on the dark side of the moon. Okay, Bob, how do you feel about hitting up the middle class? Yeah, do you want to smack up the middle class here first?
I'll smack up the middle class. I'm happy you're throwing this one at me because I found this section very interesting. So yeah, Mann sums up his analysis of the middle class in 19th century capitalism thus. A middle class emerged with a distinctive relation to power resources, with its own organizations and collective consciousness, a relation summed up by the impure dual formula, that's telling language: segmental middling participation in organizations generated by the diffuse circuits of capital, and more independent, varied participation in the authoritative nation state. And then he goes on to talk about these very these various ways that the middle class comes to participate in organization, but then is that is being partially structured, I guess, or determined by the very types of objective commonalities within these individuals and families within the relations of production that Mann formally rejects. Maybe that's the next slide, but that's very interesting, and I think it's very interesting that the idea that the class is impure, or that there's these sorts of impure organizations. He does it where it's like he's essentially doing an analysis. Right, that he's essentially doing an analysis of middle class formation that his own framework would reject. Is what right, and I love when I actually have to say, like, it's almost like his theory is less interesting than I don't know we describe his analysis, because how Wright lays out how the middle class come to form common connections or common understanding themselves as a class, for instance, uniting members of the petit bourgeois, the professionals, and the careerists, I actually think is pretty on point. Very interesting, right? The fact that they have enough excess income to invest in speculative investments. I've seen that. That is how members of the petit bourgeois and the professionals come to become united with many members of the corporate class. I've seen that play out. And things like common family connections. And when he talks about connections, it's very similar types of family experiences. It sounds a lot like Bourdieu's habitus. Bourdieu being, I think, an interesting case of a kind of anti-Marxist intellectual who actually produces a lot of interesting theoretical concepts that are valuable to Marxism, in my opinion, almost like he's not capable of understanding the implications of his own arguments, which is sort of what Mann is doing here. So I found that very interesting. What did you guys think about this section on the middle class, and what did you think about the description of the different ways the petit bourgeois, the careerists, these waged or salaried employees moving up the corporate ladder, and these professionals come to understand themselves or come to form commonalities as part of a class essentially for itself? Because I thought it was interesting.
I think the interesting thing to me right now, from this framework, is that the middle class in America is actually very splintered. The careerists and professionals are Democrats for the most part, and the petit bourgeois are Republicans for the most part.
That's exactly right.
Fucking hate each other. Yeah. It's so the sort of the hybrid nature of the class, the instability of the class, I feel has been pushed to the extreme in America because of partially because of geographical factors, but also partially because of accidental political factors.
Couldn't you argue that we're seeing something similar sort of play out? Maybe, I guess this is very contentious, and I don't think anyone really knows how to think about this at the moment. But in Canada, the Freedom Convoy protests, right? It's the real driving force, from what I can tell, behind that. It's like the petit bourgeois of the trucker industry, and they are and they're allied
and other petit bourgeois, right? You look at the
restaurant owners, the shop owners.
Yeah, right? The biggest donors to the Freedom Convoy were people like firing range owners and RV sales owners and these very small scale capitalists for the most part.
just like the strongest supporters of Trump, people argue they were like the guy with the boat siding business that had no education, who lived who tended to live in downwardly, who were actually doing well in terms of where they were in terms of income distribution, but were living in rapidly downwardly mobile regions of the United States. And it's like those people are now like fundamentally opposed politically to the careerists and the professionals who have broken with the as kind of like a sort of enlightened liberal manager, like I don't want to say a managerial class because I know that's a problematic framing, but like, you know, their position within the system.
There's also a discussion we talked about when we read the 18th Brumaire, right, Tom, about in the 18th Brumaire where Marx lays out like why these different fractions of the middle class tend to be at odds with each other. We should maybe like revisit that at some point because it is pretty interesting. And basically it has to do with the relationship to the state and capital, where the careerists and professionals tend to benefit from the state in ways that the PB do not. This really has a lot to do with why the Freedom Convoy or why the Republican Party is like middle class, but in a way that is very, very different from the middle class in the Democrats, who are allied with big capital and the state, because all of these different groups benefit from state regulation in the ways that the PB do not.
As demonstrated every time a convoy protester decks a CBC journalist.
Yeah, exactly. that is when the latent objective factors become subjective and then subsequently material.
I would go so far as to say that this is the tendency across capital, that like with kind of the defeat of like a left, both the communists and the social democrats, and rate of profit coming in and reallocating production away, that all that capital ends up with is a fight between the petty bourgeois and the large corporations as our politics. That's what we get until the workers rise, if they can rise again. Like that is our politics, between like a woke state, a woke
woke capitalism,
woke capital versus basically
the Trump horde,
right? And you see the same thing, like I've been looking at a lot of different types of media over the last few months, and you see it. It's the same thing in all of these different countries. Like they have like they give out about like sexuality, transgender, all this stuff, all on this petty bourgeois mentality. But it's our politics until something new comes. That's the dynamic.
Yeah, and I think it mainly, like, there's a lot of different factors, but the degree to which there is a division between town and country is strongly predictive of how severe the conflict would be, I think. The more you have the division between town and country, the more extreme this politics becomes.
Just like it was stated in the classic Marxist text, Country Mouse, City Mouse.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we do this part?
No, not yet.
Well, we kind of talked around it though, because you did a good job there, Bob, of like fleeting over instead of reading all the boring slides.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I should have gone straight through. I got excited by this part in this slide. This was the part of the slide where I was like, "Oh, this is really interesting." Like,
no, Bob, that's good. That's good because the slides are here just to structure the talk, so we don't literally have to read them, right? So yeah, it's just that I'm not as coherent. So I think
I'll just read the 3 points in brief so that everybody is familiar with what they are exactly. So the the middle class is integrated according to 3 points. They all participate in economic hierarchy. The life chances of individuals are shaped by their connection to capitalist hierarchy, right? Of course, as is everybody's in capitalism, but of course, the middle class being in the middle is more acutely nervous about their position. Number 2, we have consumption patterns. Their relatively high incomes underwrite distinctive, comfortable standards of living. This forges a sense of common position and underwrites intermarriage and other forms of demographic class formation. The middle class, we are obsessed with lifestyle, fashion, art, all of these kinds of things that are like consumption activities. This is extremely, extremely important to our social interactions. Yep. In a way that working class people can't afford to engage in, and in a way that the haute bourgeoisie, like, they engage in it, but they don't really need to worry about it as much. Yeah. It's not as much of an obsession for them. It's more of a just kind of a thing you do.
It's why I made the connection to Bourdieu and Habitus. It seems like it strongly connects to like that idea of consumption patterns being a class uniter, right? Like basically, like look at what in North America. Look at like West Coast EDM festival culture. Yeah, right. As a huge it's like no, they're all middle and upper class people whose capacity to spend a shit ton of money and not work for a week or not work for like a month every summer. It defines their membership of a common group, and if you're not a member of that group, you don't get treated super well.
Or like you can go back in time to like I mean, this is to some degree a thing even now, but like the obsession among the middle class in older times with having your kids learn to play piano and play piano for other middle class people when they come over. That's a kind of consumption pattern of this type.
Yeah, you play violin, but not fiddle.
That's right. That's right.
If you ask me, it's like it's a large reason for why a lot of art and like high-end classical music and jazz becomes abstract and atonal. It's because now the working class people can access Beethoven and Bach and these ones that are easy to on your ear. Like, we got to be able to differentiate ourselves by liking this other thing that that now that everybody else can access, not just the lords and the rich bourgeoisie.
I mean, there's the interclass differentiation, but there's also the intraclass distinction, which is the thing that Bourdieu focuses on in that book. Is you have to distinguish yourself from other middle class people by making these aesthetic gestures and accomplishments that are daring, innovative, and highly technical. Because that's really what you got to go on in terms of your life chances. Because intermarriage and property is so important.
Is that what this podcast is? Is that what what our podcasts are?
I don't know. Maybe that's the thing that happens whenever anybody, any podcaster reads Bourdieu, they have a very uncomfortable moment of self-realization. Because it's like I'm looking at myself through this lens and it hurts.
Yeah, that's true.
I hope additionally we are doing something useful, but certainly I don't think I would be doing this podcast if I weren't part of this like middle class that is defined here.
The usefulness is secondary. Let's be honest here. No, just...
Oh yeah, because like I get so much clout for being on this podcast, Tom. You have no idea.
Oh,
it's like I go down to like the brew pub, and I'm like, yo, I was just on from Alpha to Omega yesterday.
I
don't
have
know if you've
never.
heard of it. It's kind of a big deal. We were talking about Michael Mann's theory of class and Wright's critique of it. It was pretty heavy.
I must say, like, I've never met anybody in the real world who ever said, "Oh, I listened to your podcast." Oh dear.
Oh, Tom, and you've been at this so long too.
The sign of a true failure. Keep going,
dear.
Kyle. Keep going.
All right. The final one here is capital investments. So the three fractions of the middle class can convert income into small investment capital. Definitely underlining the small part. So we're talking here about, I guess, like in contemporary times, this would be like property ownership, owning a house or maybe two. Or if you are actually PB, you might even have like fairly significant by middle class standards small capital investments, right? Like, you know, when we're talking about the petty bourgeoisie, these are typically people these days who would be like millionaires, multimillionaires. They do have what to them and to people beneath them in the class hierarchy would seem to be fairly significant capital investments, but to people in the actual haute bourgeoisie look like, you know, a rounding error of a rounding error.
Right. A lot of these people, I think, are people with, rental properties and stuff like that.
Oh yeah, like slum rental landlords, landlords of any type, definitely fall under that capital investment category. You could be like, you could, if you're petty bourgeoisie, you might even own like two businesses that have some capital investments, and you might have a fairly substantial stock portfolio or ownership in some kind of like resort development property. Like these are things that are all very out of the reach of somebody who is working class or probably also professional or a careerist. But nevertheless, they are small in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation, Kyle, because I remember going back and reading like kind of like the kind of stuff about the ideologues of like the neoliberal shift, and like when all the think tanks and the Chicago boys and stuff were trying to popularize the idea of like profit sharing and like stock options for like workers and companies. And their argument was, the argument was precisely that they hoped it would do for the working class what it did for the middle class, right? Which is like give people a feeling that they had ownership in the system, even though the diffusion and deregulation of finance, as like guys like David Harvey pointed out, like since the 70s has actually been associated with like a massive concentration of wealth and ownership of the means of production. It gives you a sense, and like for the middle class, I think that it's a huge thing. Yeah, you're the slumlord, but you're investing in this or that, and it's the same like you start having a kind of a material financial incentive for the growth imperative of those companies.
Especially in today's politics, it's about if whether or not you are a homeowner, and that is going to have a very decisive effect on your politics, because home ownership has through like state action has been turned into like
it's commodified again.
This sort of exhaustive capital investment for the non-PB sections of the middle class. Yeah,
it's a funny.
Yeah, so.
Like startup of you.
Yeah, and all of all of these all of the like employee share schemes is like that. I worked for Ericsson, and you had this like you would get a certain number of shares every year, and if you wanted as a bonus, and if you wanted, you could like put your own money into it. And I worked there in the .com boom, and everybody was like, yeah, you should just load up and buy the maximum amount of shares. So I did. I put like $2 or $3 grand from when I started working. It was quite a lot for me into it, and the shares. Then the the bubble burst in the .com era, and the shares went from being worth 200 SEK, 230 SEK, I think, to 2.5 SEK, and we lost 99% of our value.
And that's why the middle class is so plagued with anxiety.
Yeah. I still own the shares technically, that they're somewhere, but they've worth so little now. Like, they went from being worth like, $5,000 worth of shares to being worth like 50 quid. And I haven't followed them since. I don't know what they're worth. Maybe they're worth 100 quid now or something.
I think you can tell that I'm like just such a dork, because for some reason I'm just making all these connections in my mind to those like new NFT scheme video games.
Yeah.
It's like play to earn, right? And then you'll just be like, right? It's just like, yeah, it's like, oh, are gamers a class? Like, just like a really shitty class.
Gamers are gamers a class.
Yeah.
The gametariat is being exploited.
The game materials you can just like oh yeah, it's just keep fucking grinding it out, right? And then you're gonna get like the Ubisoft Ghost Recon pants, and you can sell them on the Ubisoft controlled NFT market or whatever, right? And then the NFT market collapses, and they're like, oh my god, you mean I was playing all these games just for fun? Like,
I can't. Guys, I think I might be rich, because I think it's gone back up to like 70 20 years later. So I might have like a few grand sitting somewhere.
Tom, you might want to sell those stocks before the next crash.
You mean before 4 weeks ago?
Yeah.
No, I mean the next one that will be even deeper.
Oh yeah, September. It's coming September. It's always coming.
Yeah, probably. I mean, never ask a Marxist for financial advice, but
this is
what
the
do they say?
I just don't see how we're not going to get a deeper one. Yeah.
But this is the first time, like with COVID, we had a bit of a crash too, when we expected that when that happened. But like, this is the first time since 2008 where like fucking people are really going, all right, it's coming. I feel like everybody's just going, it's coming.
Yeah. Like
but you too lurk on Wall Street bets.
Yes. Yeah. It's like how Marx talks about how like there were financial crises prior to the tulip bubble that were caused by like a bad harvest or war or something like that, or disease. But then you have the endogenous capitalist crises that come out of the speculative realm, and that's what we're going to see, not the one that's caused by COVID.
Exogenous versus endogenous, motherfuckers. Yes, I hear you. Okay.
There's also exogenous factors like war and disease and stuff.
Yeah, but I don't think war is exogenous. I think it's endogenous.
Well, yeah, fair enough.
Yeah. Okay. We're on to multiple levels of class analysis. It's our last section. How are we getting on, Bob? What's your timeline like? When do you have a hard stop?
My timeline's great. Yeah, I would have like another hour. So
okay, yeah, okay. Just give me 1 second. I need to get a glass of water. My water's run out. So just give me 1 second. Or if you want, Kyle, do you want to start? Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just read this while you're out.
I'll be back in a second, and I'll be back on. Okay, you can read away.
All right. So we're talking here about multiple levels of class analysis. Wright's central criticism of Mann's announced strategy of class analysis is his dismissal of the relevance of studying what he calls quote-unquote latent classes. Wright thinks that a deeper understanding of these historical processes is advanced by trying to systematically bring together the three conceptual clusters of class analysis: classes as social structure, classes as social groups, and classes as organized social actors. Mann's objections to the study of latent classes comes, at least in part, from his rejection of the classical class in itself / class for itself conceptualization of class. In that understanding, there is a one-to-one mapping of classes formed as collective actors and the categories within objectively defined class structures, combined with a teleological theory of the process by which the structurally defined classes are transformed into classes as collective actors, correctly in Eric Olin Wright's view. To reject Mann's programmatic position does not mean reverting to the teleology of class in itself / class for itself. One can believe that class relations and class structures are real and generate real effects, without also believing in any one-to-one mapping between the complex structure of class relations and the formation of collective actors. So it's like you get the kind of like I don't know, the sort of like left post-Marxist position of like we don't agree with Mouffe and Laclau, but that economic dimension is irrelevant. But we also don't believe that there is a necessary one-to-one mapping between the economic latent class, the class in itself, and what emerges as the class for itself.
And how that class understands itself and its objectives and its position, right? Like it's like the difference between saying, as I said before, it's the difference between saying that there's no necessary connection between in itself and for itself, and to say that there's necessarily no connection, right? Where it's like it's all just magical discourse. At the same time, like I mean, people like Laclau and Mouffe were able to. The reason why they were able to make careers of that shit was because they were able to, argue, that there was not like too much simplistic determinist linkages between in itself and for itself. But like, and then use that to make an analysis that ultimately is not very convincing. But what I'm wondering is, here's a question for you two. It may be that I'm just not brushed up enough on my old school red theory, but does the relationship, do the terminology class in itself and class for itself need to be understood teleologically? Like in my mind, it feels like it has some analytical value, right? Like that we're kind of discussing in this.
I think that the problem is that kind of like the inheritance of the Hegelian framework in that is implied in class in itself, class for itself, like that you're kind of treating them as whole concepts, and the logic follows that the class in itself would become a class for itself that is like wholly self-conscious. It would go from being, like latent to being conscious. And I don't think that
Marx is a hard
teleological to follow that line of reasoning, but it's basically, I would say it's suggested by the framework, even if it's not a necessary conclusion.
Right. And like from my understanding of it, like, and forgive me if I have this wrong, like I don't think Marx is like a hard teleological, like.
No, I don't think so. It's the difficulty
of it becoming, and the structure of the thing will lead to a certain types of behaviors, like, and whether like the working class like wins or not, say they get defeated, but the same structural things occur to cause those kind of oppositional forces to rise again, and I feel like for Marx it's kind of like, whether I am reading this into Marx my way or whether I have this correct, or I'm not sure, but it's like that there is a kind of a system logic whereby these things occur again and again, and perhaps for Marx he feels like there's inevitability it will dominate at one stage. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, well, it's that difficulty of like the final section of Capital Volume 1 treats these things in extremely totalizing terms, because like it's basically like, okay, well, what if we do like a two-class system analysis, and what comes out of that, right?
Yeah.
And then you get the second to last chapter of Capital Volume 1, which is extremely apocalyptic, and is talking about like, the integument being burst and a new world being born and all this kind of stuff, right? And all of that, like that section of Capital Volume 1 is very teleological and totalizing. But then, of course, you get stuff like the 18th Brumaire, or even like other sections of Capital Volume 1 that are more like ethnographic or sociological that don't really suggest that. So I think you could certainly read that teleological reading out of what Marx wrote, but it's not a necessary thing that you would have to conclude, or even what I think Marx actually believed most of the time, even if sometimes he did believe in the 100% teleological apocalyptic, the working class is going to go kick the capitalist class's ass and get communism, and it's going to be like an everybody's on board kind of effort.
Right. Yeah. I was just going to say exactly the same thing. In Capital, he sets up the capitalists and the workers, blah, blah, blah. But when you look at the Brumaire, that way where he does the class analysis in the Brumaire, Kyle.
Yeah,
it's micro class analysis. So it's like he's looking at different abstracted layers of the analysis and saying things. And then, that's the way I view it. That for me is you have these system logic, you have these tendencies in the system that throw up, battles, and you would think that, I don't know, to me it seems like that if the dynamics are reoccurring, and if they keep reoccurring, in some sense, as a kind of system logic, you would expect the working class to win at some stage. And if they manage to do it and win correctly, it becomes difficult if the dynamics are changed. And I kind of look at the Marx's ideas in that kind of a sense, as opposed to the working class will just rise up and beat them. Yay, first time off or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I think you're completely right that there is this tendency from the class in itself to the class for itself that you see again and again and again, and is really the most valid part of that whole framework. Right. You don't need to think in terms of the teleology. Well, it's a weak teleology, right? It's
right.
It's what do you call that?
A tendency?
Yeah, it is a tendency, but I was thinking in Aristotelian terms. It's not governed by the final cause, it's governed by there's another cause in the four cause structure that's the one that we're talking about. Yeah.
What was it? I was going to say one thing else, but I would say that the teleological view that's been put forward here would be the dominant view, I would say, in the academy, Western academy, of what Marx meant.
Yeah, probably. And in popular culture too, I would say.
Yeah, overwhelmingly.
It's because that is the view that the
manifesto
Leninist parties promoted for most of the 20th century. So yeah,
and that was convenient for bourgeois ideology too, because they could look at the least kind of nuanced take of kind of hardcore Leninist organized, and then the kind of straw man rejection of that just basically becomes grade 10 social studies curriculum in North America, right?
Yeah.
Hey, well, the middle class exists, so we don't have to think about any of this stuff.
We don't have to worry about it because everybody's middle class. Blah,
Capitalism
blah, blah,
naturally produces a middle class, and the middle class is somehow the ruling class.
Yeah, right. The other thing I would say as well is, in the Communist Manifesto is pretty much, it can be read teleologically, and it's the dominant short text anyone would read.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
Stages of history, right?
Yep. All right, let's move on.
Sorry, yeah. Oh, sorry. Have you finished this slide? You have?
Yeah. We're done. Yeah.
Okay. Fire ahead of this one then. Is this the same? Yeah. Keep going there. This is a short
one. Adam Przewalski states the problem well. Positions within social relations constitute limits upon the success of political practice. But within these historically concrete limits, the formation of classes in struggle is determined by struggles that have class formation as their effect. So, okay. Within these historically concrete limits, the formation of classes in struggle is determined by struggles that have class formation as their effect. So yes,
So the creation of the working class was what allowed the working class to act as a class in itself, for itself.
Yes, there is a struggle that gives birth to the formation of a class in struggle, like hyphenized class for itself kind of thing, right?
Right,
And
as
it
the working
couldn't even conceptualize the class, like that class struggle,
Yes.
without there being some relation to those actors as individuals and collectives within certain determined relations of production.
Yeah,
right? And
yeah,
relations both within and between classes. Otherwise, what are they struggling about?
Exactly. If this claim is correct, if the structure of class relations imposes limits on possible formations of collective class actors, it is worthwhile to try to understand the general properties of these sets of class relations or class structures that generate these limits. I mean, I think this is extremely obvious. We should probably just move on to the next slide. Wright's work on contradictory class locations is one strategy of doing this. He has argued that individuals are located in complex ways within social relations of production. So this is complexity in the way jobs are located within the social relations of production. In particular, jobs are relationally defined with respect to both capitalist property relations and authority relations. We also have complexity in the way market relations are linked to employment relations. This is especially relevant for the problem of skills and expertise. And then we have complexity in the temporal aspects of class locations. This corresponds closely to Mann's discussion of careers positions and Goldthorpe's notion of the service class. You can also throw in there like people who are petty bourgeois or bourgeois, but had like 3 years of their life where they were living, in a kind of working class situation because they weren't getting much money from their parents, right? Like they were doing a service job or something like this, and then boom, their inheritance kicks in, and then they resume their normal class position.
It also sort of explains the weird. It also explains kind of like the weird shift, like ideological shift of like the immiseration and precarity created by neoliberalism means that they're large sections of young people like who were raised in working middle class families who rapidly saw their position, the relational position within relations of production shift very rapidly relative to their parents, and they often have like so much of the debates around like the new the managerial class, all this sort of stuff, all these debates around kind of cultural politics of the left. Like I always see a lot of it is like, yeah, there's like a lot of people who were raised with middle class habitus who are now in a working class position, and they're very angry because their parents and their teachers did not tell them that their life was going to be this way, right?
Yeah, like their parents were able to own property, but they won't be able to.
They won't be able to, right? Their employment prospects, even within the same industries, and their job security is different relative to their parents who may be professionals or whatever, right?
For sure. So now we also have complexity in the way individuals are linked to class relations through family and kinship. So this is especially salient in households in which both husband and wife are in the labor force. I mean, it's also very salient in families from cultures where like you have really strong relationships with your like extra atomic family unit family groupings, right? Like like Chinese families where it's like you're all kind of engaged in each other's business and working towards an economic goal together. And then we also have complexity generated by the way people within what I term, or what Wright terms, privileged locations within the process of exploitation are able to capitalize their surplus income in the form of capital investments. So if you are a coder and there's a lot of demand in the labor market for coding work relative to other forms of work, then you might be able to use that temporary difference in purchasing power to make capital investments, just like Tom was talking about with the Ericsson investments that he has.
You could look at outside of tech, like in North America too. I would argue that the labor aristocracy of the oil and gas industry is like that.
Yeah.
They're raised with working class habitus. They often don't have higher education, although obviously like the engineer professionals are the ones that do the best. But like sectoral booms allow them to reap massive incomes, even while capital has structured, fossil capital has structured the regime of the energy industry to essentially give these people almost like a tiny pittance of resource rents in terms of wages. But the reality of high energy prices is that wages are so high that they all invest in stocks, they all invest in their houses, they own their own homes, and their kind of class position, or at least their understanding themselves as a class, kind of shifts in a way. They become
their
life
circumstances shift, if not their actual class position.
Yeah.
Like during the boom in Dublin, like bricklayers were making so much money. Like bricklayers were making like €1 a brick, and they were like literally doing like 100 bricks an hour. And they were like, so they were like raking home like €800, €1,000 a day, for like a 2 or 3 year period. They just made insane money, And like these guys are like driving like, BMW 8 Series, brickies, crazy stuff.
But I think what's so interesting here is that like all of these things we're talking, the bricklayers, the energy workers, the kind of privileged coders, it's like if there was not some connection between their life circumstances and their class position within productive relationships, there'd be nothing to analyze. There'd be nothing to even attempt to explain. And politics, essentially, even political strategizing as socialists becomes almost impossible, right? Like, how would you even do it?
Yeah, you just chase whatever the issue of the day is on a
that's where we are now.
Purely opportunistic basis.
Yeah, that's why I base my entire political strategy around monkey JPEGs.
Yeah. Right-clicking them, of course, not right-clicking monkey pictures.
Yes, that's right.
Right, Kyle. Last slide.
Okay, so we have an individual's objective location within class relations is determined by the totality of these complexities. These locations are not classes. They are locations within complexly structured class relations. A class structure is defined by the set of such locations within some appropriate unit of analysis. A central goal of class is to understand the causal connections between the objectively defined properties of class relations on the one hand and class formation and organized class struggle on the other. I mean, yes, that is true. That is a true statement. Like, I feel like this chapter was like kind of interesting, but it was also it's like explaining class to like the world's most stupid and out of touch person, like really having to belabor the point that should be obvious.
How can
academia?
How can Mann say that what did he say, that it's of no interest? What was the term he used? Let's see. Such a latent class.
Objective class.
Yeah.
No sociological or little sociological interest.
And then he goes on and talks about that's how he frames his actual work then.
Like I mean, I think
no
Wright does a good job of like setting up, here's Mann's like bullshit general argument, and here is how his specific argument contradicts his general argument.
Right.
And therefore his whole framework is bogus. And the only way it seems vaguely convincing is because he can refer to specific analyses that look plausible, but don't actually follow the general framework.
It's a little. I keep having the phrase in my mind. It's like, you know, you say your mouth is writing checks your butt can't cash. You know, like it's like his theory is writing checks that his analysis can't cash, or vice versa. You know, like
vice versa, right?
Vice versa. Yeah. His analysis is writing checks. His theory, like he set up. I think I had this conversation with you before, Kyle, when I was reading that Laclau populism book that I find Laclau very wrong-headed, but also kind of interesting. I have some interesting ideas but he doesn't understand the implications of his ideas. You know, it's like in that book, he lays out this whole operation that's pretty plausible in terms of how populist and even socialist movements discuss their common interests and objectives as a discourse, but then he then acts as though the only thing that really matters is how people discuss their common interests and not any actual material underlying connection they might have relative to even the classes they oppose. And what's then interesting is the best section of that book, in my opinion, is when he goes through all of his historical analyses of the rise and ultimate and inevitable demise of various populist movements. But the only way he can explain them is not by how they talk with each other, but why, like what role did the low-ranking military officials and the peasants and the workers in like Perón's Argentina, like what were their economic interests relative to each other and capitalism and so on? And how did that allow them to describe their interests as members of the common people against the elites or so on? And then why did that fall apart? And he doesn't have any way of doing that other than some analysis of who these people are, how they make their money, and how that relates to Argentinian capitalism. And so it's like the analysis is actually really good in those sections, and there's elements of his discursive analysis that make sense, but it doesn't actually. But he cannot link his actual theoretical claims with the analysis he does, which in the end I think is actually pretty good. This seems to me like this as well. It's like Mann's analysis seems much more interesting than his theory, because his theory cannot really get him to the place where he can coherently make his analysis. He has to just kind of. It's almost like he has to sublimate it.
Oh, 100%. There's like there's definitely some sleight of hand being played in all of these kinds of academic works, and it's like one of those cons where like the con person is taken in by their own con. Like where they
like riding the snake.
They're not self-aware about how bullshit their own framework is.
Or do they care?
Well, I do believe humans don't care to feel like they're hypocrites. That's one thing. Like, unless you're a sociopath, so like so much ideology is like self-rationalization. Like. It's very hard to like think of yourself as someone who is completely hypocritical or not living by their professed beliefs or values. So it's like, I feel like sometimes you just have an incentive to pretend like what you're saying makes sense. And I think academia is just terrible for that, right? Like it's just the worst for it. Like people are constantly contradicting themselves. Right. They put on that little hat when they write a paper and they're like, oh, this makes sense. And then you talk with them at the bar and you realize like, oh, you don't actually live your life as though what you wrote makes any sense.
Yes.
It would be impossible.
Like the classic academic absurdity. Tom, you've put an image up on the screen here, which I believe is a 9/11 joke, but British.
Yes.
Too soon.
Too soon, Tom.
It's only been 21 years.
It really made me laugh.
This is pretty good. This is very funny.
So for the listeners, this is a depiction of two Big Bens next to each other.
That in itself makes me laugh.
There is a London there's a London city bus that has been crashed, like been flung into one of the Big Bens, and the other one is about to impact the second Big Ben, and it's just a quote underneath that says, "Your Majesty, there's been a second bus."
It's just like, it is kind of glorious, right? I feel like it took me a minute, like, or at least 10 seconds to be like, wait a minute, I think there's only one Big Ben.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of it.
You know, it's great. No, it really hit when I realized that was what was going on. Like,
what I really like is that, like, the bus that's already hit comes in at quite a sharp angle, and then the other one that's coming in, like, it's just driving along the road.
Yeah.
Oh god.
That's just what they want you to believe. Yeah.
We've put that chapter to rest.
God damn it! These chapters better start getting better.
Oh yeah, I'm optimistic that, like, there's gonna be some bangers. This one was not a banger, but it was all right. Like, it wasn't like
a starter. So, it's like a starter to our main course kind of a chapter.
Yeah, I hope so. I
found it a little, like, I found it generative in the sense that, like, I could see, like, oh yeah, this is a good way of laying out what doesn't really make sense about that type of thinking. It is real. I'm just not that familiar with Michael Mann, but I think at least, but you're right, Kyle. Like, it's something that's like, it's something that should be very obvious, but maybe reflects a moment in time in terms of, like, critical theory where things that were very obvious were being kind of being challenged, you know? And like, someone's got to step in and be like, I don't know, man, like, come on.
Esri's hypothesis, Esri is not here today, his hypothesis was that Wright was doing this critique not only as a way of destroying man, intellectually, and pointing out the problems with this structure of critique, but also as a sort of like subtweeting way of critiquing the Bordigists, who believe that the party is exhaustive of the class. So, it has that value in terms of, like, intra-Marxist, intra-left debates as well, of, like, if you have, like, we were talking about, like, Laclau and Mouffe, or you could talk about Bordiga, but if you have these, like, left political formations that privilege the political to an absurd extent, this argument is a good one to throw at them.
I think that's right, and I also think, they're interesting, Kyle. We'll have to touch base because I always tell you about that kind of Vancouver anti-capitalist cult, right?
Yeah.
And then, like, I was invited onto a panel recently, just because the person that someone I knew was putting it on, and I guess we were talking about I was doing some research relevant to it, and the person chairing the panel was, like, the head of that cult.
No.
I actually shouldn't say that on this. I don't know. I shouldn't say that on this podcast or say that it's a cult. That's probably a mistake. But
I can edit that out if you want.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, we can edit it out. Yeah. But the live audience will have heard it, but it won't be in the recording, at least.
Yeah, there you go.
We frequently call out various Leninist grouplets as cults on this network, so that at least is not unusual.
Yeah, it'd be interesting if in fact they're in the audience, like, they're like, "What are you talking?" Like,
yeah.
I bet, like, how big though? If Esri's making that thing that this is, like, Wright making a point, subtweeting about, like, Bordigas, like, was Wright even, like, how online was that Bordigist subculture? Like, is right really responding to that stuff?
It's possible. Like, I think kind of around the time that this book was being written, there was a bit of a Bordigas fad going on, if I remember correctly.
And so,
is that not just like an online
this bad to me, like Bordita?
Yeah. But like among left intellectuals, it certainly wasn't a general politics thing.
Yeah, it wasn't
as prevalent as like Laclau and Moof for sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
which is like, I think as our old professor Rick Runeau used to say, it's like if you push the discursive element of Gramsci too far, like eventually Gramsci just becomes a liberal.
Oh, 100%.
You know, it's like, well, the Modern Prince was the Italian Communist Party, so it wasn't Greenpeace.
yes. All right.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's it for today. So we will head off stream, and we will see you all hopefully in 2 weeks' time, if I can get the goddamn notes written up for chapter 6, which will be, let's have a look here, see what it is. Occupations as microclasses. David Gruski and Kim Whedon's reconfiguration of class analysis. So we'll have that beauty to look forward to. And well, thanks everybody for coming. We must say, of course, thanks to the chat. Who we've got Alex. We also have Naked HD XYZ Bro Cheapest Tinder Just for Sex, posting quite a lot. And then we have Mason, Diazi. And we also had, I think, auxiliary statements. And again, a lot of Naked HD XYZ, fuck Tinder, we are cheaper and fast. So thanks. Thanks to everybody for turning up today. We'll see you next time. How do I stop this?
Bye, everybody.